Hi, my name is Monica Ray. This is my first podcast episode, which is based on true crime advice and celebrity gossip. I've always been a huge fan of true crime ever since my childhood years. After doing a lot of decision making, I opted to focus my first podcast episode on Chester Turner. Now, African American serial killers don't get the same social media attention as white serial killers. Some of you have probably heard of Chester Turner, who from the late 1980s and throughout the late 1990s raped and murdered 13 women and an unborn child in the Los Angeles area. This episode is more or less about the notorious prolific serial killer Chester Turner. But I wanted to begin by taking a dive into Chester's tumultuous relationship with his ex-common law wife, Felicia Collier. The reason why I decided to start off with Miss Collier is because the media is notorious for exploiting black and brown serial killers as evil and worthless, when in fact this isn't true in most cases. As to it, the media depicts white serial killers as having a fucked up childhood, divorced parents, and etc. Let's dive into the sweet but volatile relationship of Felicia Collier and Chester Turner. Felicia and Chester attended the same elementary and junior high schools. They also lived across the street from one another. They became friends when Chester's mom asked Felicia to tutor him. Felicia agreed, being that she was a bookworm and loved to learn. Chester was actually a good kid. Felicia was aware of Chester having a crush on her, but she didn't like him in the same manner that he liked her. Felicia had become pregnant in high school by someone else she dated. The relationship between her and her daughter's father didn't work out. To top it off, Felicia didn't have a healthy relationship with her mom. Her daddy would take up for her, but that still didn't stop Felicia's mom from kicking her out the house while she was with child. Felicia had turned to Chester, who was a shoulder to lean on. She told him that she didn't have anywhere to go. Chester always had a soft spot for Felicia. He asked his mom if Felicia could stay with them. Chester's mom happily agreed. Chester and his mom adored Felicia. They showed nothing but unconditional love. Felicia had started working. While she would be at work, Chester would babysit her daughter. He treated her daughter as if she were his own. Chester would comb her daughter's hair, change her diaper, all the things that a father would do. Felicia's baby fell in love with Chester and vice versa. This is what made Felicia's feelings towards Chester evolve into something more. Felicia had actually fell in love with Chester because she could depend on him. He had her back. She decided to give him a shot at love, and they became a couple. But once they began dating, Felicia began to see another side of Chester. He began to show signs of craziness and possessiveness over Felicia. One day, a friend of hers by the name of Reginald dropped her off at the house. Felicia and Reginald were merely friends. Felicia had walked in the house, and Chester started making accusations about her dating Reginald. He would say things like, "Are you seeing him or me?" Felicia was bemused by this because she knew that there wasn't anything going on with her and Reginald. She would continuously try to reassure Chester that there wasn't anything going on with her and her friend. Chester had become angry. In a fit of rage, he balled up his fist and punched a hole in the wall. Felicia had never seen Chester so angry. Mind you, Chester was a big, stocky dude. This fit of rage scared Felicia. Reginald hadn't pulled off in front of the house yet. Felicia ran outside to get him. He told Chester he better not put his hands on Felicia, that wasn't cool. Chester asked Reginald what was he doing with his girl. Chester was convinced that Felicia and Reginald were dating behind his back. Reginald also told Chester there wasn't anything going on. He was finally able to calm Chester down. Chester told Felicia that he loved her and he would never do anything to hurt her or her daughter. He promised Felicia that he wouldn't do it again. They were both 16 years old at that time. They were in love. Felicia believed him that he would never do it again. She forgave him. But when Felicia saved enough money to move into her own apartment, Chester's jealousy grew. He didn't move in with Felicia, but the love he had for her had become an obsession. On the night of Felicia's birthday, Chester had stopped by with flowers and balloons. Felicia was ecstatic. She thought she was on top of the world. Chester wanted to spend the night, but Felicia told him no because she was exhausted and he could sleep over another night. Chester became enraged. He asked Felicia what did she mean by he couldn't spend the night. She tried to close the door, but Chester stuck his foot in the door, preventing her from closing it. Felicia tried to explain to him that she had a lot to do the next day and they could hook up after she was done. That made Chester even more angrier. Felicia could see the expression of anger on his face. He wanted his gifts back he brought her for her birthday. Felicia was taken aback by that, but she threw the balloons and flowers in his face and closed the door. After that rage, Felicia didn't want anything to do with Chester, despite him begging and pleading for another chance. Soon after, Felicia and Chester were expecting a baby of their own. The news of him becoming a father, everything was going good in their relationship. Felicia would let him visit and sometimes spend the night. Felicia felt that now Chester was going to have a child of his own, that they would be fine and be a family. Chester would buy things for their unborn baby. One Christmas day, Chester had been giving Felicia the silent treatment the entire day. She finally asked him what's wrong, because he had been quiet all day. Chester told her that he heard that she slept with a guy who lived in the neighborhood by the name of CJ. Chester was very insecure, and he knew that a lot of the girls in the neighborhood had a crush on CJ, who was fly, and all the girls wanted him. Chester assumed that included Felicia. He asked her, was it CJ she wanted? Felicia let Chester know that she didn't want CJ, and he shouldn't believe everything he heard. Next thing Felicia knew, Chester had punched her in her jaw. He angrily told Felicia to shut up before he would do it again, and he would drive the car off the road. At that point, Felicia felt that Chester was trying to kill her. Chester demanded Felicia say something to make him drive the car off the cliff, but Felicia remained silent. Chester did all of this in front of Felicia's daughter. Mind you, Felicia was still with child at that time. Felicia and her baby girl were both crying and afraid. By the time they returned home, Chester's demeanor had drastically changed into Prince Charming. Felicia immediately hopped out of the car and took her daughter from the back seat and ran into the house. Chester was steadily trying to get Felicia to talk to him as he simultaneously tried to apologize. Felicia's dad went outside to speak to Chester. Chester tried to convince Felicia's dad to make her speak to him, but her dad had some words of his own for Chester. He told Chester that he couldn't have him going around putting his hands on his daughter. He knew that Felicia and Chester were both in love with each other, and Felicia was getting ready to have his baby. Chester acted as if he understood what Felicia's dad was saying. Once again, Chester would make another one of his empty promises not to hit Felicia again. He said that he didn't mean to do it. Felicia's dad reassured her that everything was going to be all right between her and Chester. Her dad told her that Chester was a good dude, that he just gets upset sometimes. The fact that Felicia's dad liked Chester was a good sign that things would be okay. Felicia was pregnant with Chester's child, so she gave him another chance. Like most young adults in a committed relationship that has its ups and downs, Felicia wanted their relationship to work. After Felicia gave birth to their son, Christopher, Chester had begun to act strangely. He started spending a lot of time alone watching porn. It had begun to bother Felicia. She would wake up in the middle of the night and knock on the bathroom door, asking Chester to come to bed. He would be up all hours of the night watching pornographic movies. Felicia was baffled by the amount of time Chester would spend in the bathroom on those movies. Felicia was always asking Chester when was he going to come out of the bathroom and go to bed. Chester's obsession with porn started to become creepy and disturbing. His excuse for watching so much porn was due to Felicia not wanting to have sex with him. She just given birth to their son. Felicia wanted to wait until it was safe after her 6 weeks checkup. She finally put her foot down and told Chester that he could no longer watch porn in her home. She had assumed that would be the end of Chester's strange behavior. But then Chester would begin to do disappearing acts. Chester had a routine for when he would come in the house at night after work. He stopped following his routine. He'd come home around 12 to 12:30. Suddenly he began to come home 2 or 3 hours later than usual. Felicia would question Chester about his whereabouts. He would lie and say that he had to work late. Felicia knew better. Chester's job was closed at that time. He was being very discreet about his inconspicuous behavior. Felicia knew that something was up, but she just couldn't put her finger on it. She knew Chester was hiding something. As time passed, Felicia began to notice strange things. Chester's personality changed right before her eyes. It was their first Mother's Day since Chester had become a dad. They had plans to go out. Felicia was excited because he'd always wanted to do special things for her. He never arrived at the time that he said he would. Felicia continuously called Chester's phone, but to no avail. By 1 a.m. that next morning, Chester still hadn't arrived. Felicia was, of course, angry and bemused as to what the hell Chester was up to. Suddenly, there was a knock at her door. Chester had finally arrived, but he had scratches and blood on his face. Felicia could sense that something had happened to him. Felicia asked him what happened. Chester told her a fabricated story that he got into a car accident. Felicia didn't believe him. She knew she never saw their car again. She assumed the reason for Chester's mysterious disappearing acts was due to him stepping outside of their relationship with another woman. She refused to speak to Chester for a couple of weeks. Eventually, Chester put on his Prince Charming mode and he won her over. He always knew what to do to draw Felicia back in. The next time Chester showed up to Felicia's house, he had a mysterious injury that looked serious. He had a deep cut across his face that was covered in a bandage. He fabricated another story of how some guys jumped him. The contusion was deep enough Chester had to have stitches. However, Chester turned his wrath onto Felicia. One night, she was getting ready to go out with her friends. Chester had other maniacal plans for him and Felicia. He was in the mood for sex, but Felicia wasn't. She repeatedly told him no. Before she realized it, Chester had ripped her clothes off. He had locked him and her in the bathroom. Felicia's daughter could hear her mom crying and screaming for Chester to stop. Her daughter was on the other side of the bathroom door screaming for Chester to leave her mommy alone. He had sex with Felicia without her consent. When it was over, he ran out of the house. Felicia didn't know what to do except grab her gun and chase behind him. She raised her hand and aimed the gun at Chester. Unbeknownst to her, Chester had their infant son in his hands. It just so happened that one of Felicia's neighbors were outside during all the chaos. The neighbor began to shout, "No, he has the baby." If it weren't for the neighbor, Felicia would have shot Chester. Felicia demanded that Chester give her the baby back, which Chester had refused. He told Felicia that he was going to take their baby and he would never see him again. It wasn't until the cops came on the scene and they made Chester turn over his infant son to Felicia. It was then that Chester was taken into police custody. Felicia's dad had convinced her not to press charges against Chester because he gave her the baby back. Felicia ended her relationship with Chester once he had been released from police custody. She had enough of Chester's violent and uncontrollable behavior. 2 weeks later, her and Chester had a meeting at her parents' house to inform Chester that she would allow him to see their son every 2 weeks if he wanted to be in his life. Although Felicia and Chester's relationship had failed, she still wanted him to have a relationship with their son. Chester had his uncontrollable violent outbursts and can be obnoxious at times, but that didn't change the fact that he was a good father to their son. During their meeting, Felicia had undoubtedly made up her mind that her and Chester's relationship was over, but Chester still wanted to be with her. It was too late. Felicia sternly told Chester that there wasn't any more him and her, and he wasn't welcome at her home if he didn't call beforehand. Felicia's dad looked at Chester with a stern look and basically asked him did he understand Felicia's commands. I'm sorry, y'all. It's my first podcast. I'm nervous. Just give me a chance. Chester said that he understood the message. At least that's what his mouth said, but his actions spoke something totally different. Even though sitting in Felicia's parents' house at their table, he had told Felicia's dad that he understood Felicia's ultimatum, but he really didn't take it too kindly at all. I assume Chester reluctantly said that he understood because he didn't want any smoke with Felicia's dad. It was during the week that Felicia had her brother at her home visiting, when suddenly they heard a loud booming sound that came from outside. Felicia and her brother went outside to see what the loud noise was. To Felicia's astonishment, someone had thrown a break in her front windshield. Her and her brother immediately knew that Chester was behind it. Immediately after the smashing window, Chester called Felicia's house with a threatening message. He told her that he would take her and her brother out. Felicia had asked him what the hell was wrong with him. Chester replied that Felicia was his problem and he was going to solve the problem. Throughout the night, Chester had repeatedly called Felicia, harassing and threatening her to kill her and her brother. Felicia was shook to the core. She had called the police, but they were of no help. They actually told her that since no one was dead or cut, call them when something happened. Are you kidding me? I mean, what if that lunatic really had done something to Felicia and her brother? However, after a while, Chester began to take heed to Felicia's ultimatum. He calmed his big ass down. After a month had passed, Felicia's mom had called her to tell her that Chester had got himself a new girlfriend. Felicia felt relieved at the thought of Chester finally getting him a new girlfriend. Felicia assumed that now Chester would stop with all of his shenanigans. He'd even introduce Felicia to his new girlfriend. This gave Felicia confidence that he was finally over her and ready to move on. He would come pick up the baby without any drama. Felicia thought she finally would be able to live her life in peace. But then strange things began to happen to Felicia. One day, her and her 2 children were riding in her car, running errands, when she went to hit the brakes, and the brakes went straight to the floor. Felicia began to grow frantic. There wasn't anything to make her car stop. The vehicle had continued growing. The only thing that she could do was pull the emergency brake. Thank God the car came to an abrupt stop. Later, she found out that her car had a brake leak in the hose. Her brother did an inspection and told her that her brake line had been cut also. Being that all of Chester's charades and drama had quieted down, during that time it had never dawned on Felicia that it was Chester who had cut her brake line, even though just a few months prior he had threatened to kill her. Felicia was under the false hope that old boy Chester was in a good mindset. She couldn't have been more wrong. A month later, it happened again. Her brake line had been cut, but she still didn't think it was Chester. In fact, she unknowingly went to the culprit himself and told him that her brake line had been cut for a second time. Chester played the innocent role to the T. He even looked under the hood himself. He told Felicia that someone was trying to kill her. Chester told her that she needed to get protection to put an alarm in her car. Felicia was still baffled by who would want to kill her. Oblivious to the fact Chester was behind this charade, he was the furthest thing from her mind as to who was trying to kill her in an inconspicuous way. Felicia decided to purchase a second firearm. She wouldn't leave the house without it. She would either carry it in her glove compartment or in her back pocket. One afternoon, she had to pick her son up from her mother's house. Chester happened to be standing outside. He called out to Felicia. "Felicia, I need to talk to you," Felicia shouted. Felicia could see the anger. Chester called out to Felicia, "Felicia, I need to talk to you." She knew that the old Chester had returned. He suddenly started to walk towards her. Felicia drew back his hand. He suddenly started to walk towards Felicia and drew back his hand. She thought she'd seen something in it. This prompted Felicia to retrieve her pistol from out of her purse. She told Chester to stay where he was and stop. Chester didn't think the love of his life would shoot him. He began to ascend towards Felicia. She cocked her piece and pulled the trigger. Felicia was completely fed up with Chester's antics. She had her eyes closed as she shot Chester multiple times. When she reopened her eyes, Chester was laying on the ground, motionless, but he wasn't dead, even though she thought she killed her child's father. Felicia was devastated. She didn't want to have to explain to her son that she was responsible for his father's death. The detective had told Felicia that if Chester died, it would have been a murder charge. But when she found out he wasn't going to die, she was somewhat relieved. Years later, she wished she had have killed him. Chester had spent 10 weeks in the hospital. Felicia was convinced that she wasn't going to see him again once he fully recovered from his gunshot wounds. She felt confident that she would be able to move on with her life. When Chester was released from the hospital, he decided to pay Felicia a visit. She pulled up in front of her house. There was Chester sitting on her porch waiting for her. Felicia and the kids got out of the car and walked past Chester, completely ignoring him, as he repeatedly apologized to Felicia. He had the audacity to say that he wasn't mad at her for her shooting him, that he had forgiven her because it was all his fault. He also stated that he loved her. Like, really, Chester? You think? At that point, Felicia was absolutely over and done with Mr. Chester Turner. She no longer cared about him having a relationship with their son. She just wanted Chester to leave her alone. That day, when Chester made an impromptu visit at Felicia's home, would be the last time she ever see Chester until years later when she would see him on the news. It was a rainy day in 2004. She just walked in the house when her father asked her if she heard the news about Chester. Felicia was absolutely oblivious as to what her father was talking about. He informed her that Chester was all over the news and in the newspaper. Her father then showed her a newspaper clipping of how Chester had raped and killed a multitude of women. Although Felicia knew how violent Chester could be, she never would have thought that he would be a serial killer and rapist. She was astounded. Felicia began to contemplate and reflect back on all those times Chester had come home late in the wee hours of the morning with cuts and bruises on his body. She pondered if it was during that time he was out there committing those awful crimes against women. Many years ago, during her and Chester's relationship, Felicia was in a complete state of shock. She couldn't grasp the fact that her child's father, the man who helped raise her daughter and the man whom she once was head over heels in love with, was the prime suspect in sexual assault and murder. Once Chester was in police custody, detectives began linking him to more and more sexual assaults and murders throughout the Los Angeles area. Felicia had begun to grow a passion of hate for Chester. She feels even to this day that Chester should rot in hell for what he did to those women. Chester Turner was dubbed the most prolific serial killer in Los Angeles history. He was convicted of murdering 13 women and an unborn child. Felicia has a lot of sympathy for Chester Turner's victims and their families. Felicia felt like she was his first victim. She said that you don't have to be dead to be a victim of Chester's. Felicia doesn't have any physical memories of Chester. She literally burned most of their photos that they had taken with each other during their relationship. She's satisfied with the sentence Chester received, which was death. Felicia has many regrets on her meeting and being in a relationship with Chester. She wishes that she never met him. She never would have thought in her wildest dreams that the same homie that she grew up with, tutored with, would turn out to be a renowned serial killer.